On April 18th, 1999, police entered Christopher Case's apartment and they discovered his body. The coroner came in and was able to determine in relative short order that Christopher had died of natural causes. But when friends and family got a hold of the coroner's report, they turned to the police and they were like, wait, have you not heard what was happening to Chris in the week leading up to his death? And so police began interviewing the friends and family of Christopher Case, and they unraveled this totally insane story that to this day baffles investigators. Christopher Case predicted his own death. But before we get started, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel, because that's all I do, and I upload at least 3 to 4 times a week, and I'm actually trying to get to 5 times a week, so I'm all in on this thing. And if that's what you're into, then please, if you would, gently slap the like button and then subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of those weekly uploads. All right, let's get into the story. By early 1999, Christopher Case was living his best life. He was 35 years old. He had moved out to Seattle to pursue a career in music, and he had landed a job at a music company in Seattle, and he had risen to the rank of executive at that company. He was incredibly fit. He was known for being at the gym 7 days a week. He took vitamins. He took his health very seriously. He had loads of friends. People really liked him. He was very close with his family. And, despite all that, despite his popularity and success, he had been single for years. And even though he was not actively seeking a companion, his friends and family were continuously trying to set him up on dates. But Chris would prefer to not go on a date and actually stay home by himself and listen to music, because Chris had an obsession with a very specific type of music. He loved music from ancient times, specifically from Egypt. And so he would stay home instead of go out on dates and, crush ancient Egyptian music. That was like his idea of a great night. On April 11th of 1999, Chris was on a business trip because part of his job required a ton of travel. And he was on a trip with a couple of his coworkers, who were also friends of his. They go out to San Francisco, and on the 11th, they decide to go out for dinner that night. And one of his coworkers decides to bring along a friend who was someone that lived in the area. So they get to dinner, and one of them has their friend, who's an older woman, very attractive, very kind of intense looking woman. She was about 20 years older than Chris. That was his guess. And she sits down, and the four of them are just kind of having a nice conversation. And at some point, the older woman really takes an interest in Chris. And Chris takes an interest in her because it would turn out that they had a lot in common. And then she actually admitted to him that she was really into music from ancient times and actually has a specific interest in music from ancient Egypt. And so to Chris, he's like, how can this be? And he's like, this is my passion. I love that type of music. And they really hit it off. Now, Chris was not looking for any sort of romantic involvement with this woman. He was just so excited to talk about something he loved. And so all night, Chris and this older woman are chatting it up, and they're super into each other. He was looking at her purely from a platonic sense, but it was becoming clear by the end of the night, at least Chris was realizing this, that she was looking at him with a romantic angle. She was interested in Chris. And in fact, right as he's kind of realizing this, she asks him if he wants to leave with her and go back to her place. And he politely declines because he's not interested. He loved chatting with her about music and other things they had in common, but he wasn't interested in her romantically. And she became a little bit more aggressive and said, no, come on, let's get out of here. I got a place right down the road. We can go listen to music and hang out in my place. And he felt really uncomfortable, and he kept saying no, but she wouldn't let it go. And so finally, as she's literally trying to get him to say yes, he says, hey, you know what? I've had a long night. I'm going to go. And so he stands up to leave, and the woman goes from being very flirtatious and friendly to very angry at Chris. And she looks at him and kind of abruptly says to him,
I'm actually a witch, and I'm going to put a curse on you. You're going to be dead within a week.
Okay. And he just leaves. So the next morning, on April 12th, Chris gets up and he heads to the airport and he flies back to Seattle. When he lands in Seattle, he calls his friend Sammy, who was one of his very close friends back when he lived on the East Coast. He just wanted to share this weird experience with a close friend. And so they're kind of laughing about the whole thing. Neither of them are taking the curse seriously at all. It was like, you really dodged a bullet. It's good you did not go home with her. So in good spirits, Chris hangs up the phone with Sammy, and for the next 24 hours, Chris would fall right back into his regular daily life in Seattle. Nothing out of the ordinary happened. But all that would change starting the night of April 13th, which would have been 48 hours after his encounter with this woman in San Francisco. So Chris lives alone. He doesn't have pets. And he gets into bed that night and he's laying there, and before he falls asleep, he hears whispering coming from outside of his bedroom in the kitchen area, kind of near the front door. And he's thinking to himself, like, I didn't just hear whispering. Like, what? No one's in here. What's going on? And he's hearing the whispering, and then it kind of stops. And before he gets up to investigate, he's like, okay, I probably was just hearing things. That wasn't real. And he's just kind of laying there trying to go to sleep, and then he hears it again. Except now it's not coming from the kitchen area. It's coming from a separate area in his apartment outside of the room he's in. And so now he's wondering, like, did someone sneak into my house? Like, is there a burglar in my house right now? And so he quietly gets out of his bed and he walks over to his door, he opens it up, and he can still hear the whispering, and it's coming from like his laundry room a little ways away. But as soon as he opens the door and he pokes his head out, the whispering stops. And he's just standing there, like, looking around, like hoping that there isn't anything in his apartment. And then out of the corner of his eye, near the front door, he sees something dash across his periphery. Like a shadowy figure basically darts across the room. And so he looks over, and he's immediately afraid that it really is a burglar in his room. And as he's looking, he's turning the light on next to him, he's looking around, and he starts hearing the whispering again, and now it's coming from another section of his house. So he just starts turning on all the lights and looking around to try to, like, make sure no one's in his apartment. He's not even thinking about the whispering. He's just looking for this shadowy figure that he saw run past him. And so he's looking all over his apartment. All the lights are on. It's a small apartment. And as soon as he feels comfortable that the door's locked still, everything's locked, and there's nobody here, that's when he realizes that that whispering is still happening. And so he turns back around, and now the whispering's coming from his bedroom where he was. And so he walks over to his bedroom and looks inside, and he can't pinpoint the whispering. Like, he keeps hearing it and walking to wherever it's coming from, and as soon as he gets near it, the whispering stops. And he's thinking to himself, like, am I dreaming? Is this a dream? Am I losing my mind? Did somebody slip me something, like, last night? Like, what's wrong with me? So he has this horrible night where he's up all night chasing down whispers in his apartment that keep vanishing, and then seeing shadowy figures running around and lurking in corners, but he can't ever see them when he looks at them. And so the next morning on April 14th, when the sun comes up, he hasn't slept, the first phone call he makes is to Sammy, his friend. And he's totally panicked. And we know about this phone call because Sammy would tell police about all her interactions with Chris over the course of this week. She would say that he was totally panicked. And she even thought, as she's taking this phone call, that it's just so weird, that Chris is scared of noises in his apartment and, like, figures moving around in his apartment, because it's so unlike Chris. He's, definitely a skeptic. He's just like he's a no BS kind of guy. So the idea that he would suddenly be terrified of something paranormal running around his apartment just seems so unlike him. But as she's listening to him, he was so scared about what was in his apartment. He knew it wasn't a person because he looked everywhere. There was no people. And that's the only reason he didn't call the police, is because he didn't want to tell the police that some shadow figure that's whispering in my apartment is harassing me. Like, what are the police gonna do? So Sammy hangs up the phone with Chris after trying to reassure him and just hopes that whatever that was doesn't happen again. But unfortunately for Chris, the night of the 14th now, he's going to bed again, and he starts hearing the whispers, and immediately he's out there looking, lights on. He's looking for these whispers. They keep disappearing. He can't find the source. He's getting frustrated. He's scared. He keeps seeing that thing dart around his apartment. Except this night, he also noticed that he would look, and he could get close enough to where he could break out the silhouette of what looked like a person, like lingering in the corner of his apartment, but he'd go closer to it and it would disappear. It was like the manifestations of what he was seeing, the whispers and this figure running around his apartment, were becoming more vivid. But he's also thinking, like, I didn't sleep the night before. This could be my imagination. I don't know if this is happening, but he's spiraling and he knows it. So the next day on the 15th, he doesn't call Sammy, but he calls a couple of his other friends that are anonymous, and they would all tell police that they got a similar story that Sammy had gotten that first night after the 14th. No matter what was happening, Chris believed it was happening, and Chris was terrified. But this wasn't even the worst of it yet. So that night on the 15th, Chris gets in bed, and now he's barely slept for 2 consecutive nights, and he's determined to just go to sleep. That he's trying to tell himself that everything that you've experienced the past couple nights is probably brought on by stress. It's brought on by now certainly a lack of sleep. So he's telling himself, like, just go to sleep. Just get in bed and go to sleep. So he gets in bed and he's laying there and he does fall asleep. But he wakes up in the middle of the night and he can't move his body. He's paralyzed, he can't move, and he's totally awake. And he starts hearing whispering. And now his level of fear is so high because now he's immobile. But the past 2 nights he's heard that whispering in his apartment, and he's seen that figure moving around his apartment. And so he's laying there in darkness because he went to bed in darkness, and he starts hearing whispering outside his room, and then it stops. And then he starts hearing whispering inside of his closet, and then it stops. And then he hears whispering right underneath his bed, and he can't move. And he's just laying there praying that nothing horrible is going to happen to him, that this is just a dream. And then out from underneath his bed, right next to him, he can only turn his eyes. This black figure, this shadowy black figure emerges right next to his bed. And it's looking down at him. He can't make out any facial expressions, but he can clearly define, a figure is hovering over him. And it reaches down and puts its hands around his neck and begins to throttle him. And Chris is like gagging, he can't breathe, but he can't move. And at some point the thing begins to lift him off of his bed by his neck and then throws him back down, and then the figure vanishes. Chris still couldn't move. He's choking to breathe, but he can't move, and he's just waiting for this thing to come back. And he knows that more than likely, whatever this is probably going to kill him this night. So he's laying there just thinking, oh my God, I'm about to die, I'm about to die. But the thing doesn't come back, and Chris can't move. And at some point, Chris, probably out of just pure, adrenaline crash or something, he falls asleep. And so when Chris wakes up and he can move again, he notices there's blood inside of his bed on his sheets. And then he looks at his hands, and at the tips of all 10 fingers are these incisions, like someone had intentionally cut open the top of every finger, something he certainly didn't do. And his bed is covered in blood from these 10 cuts on his hands. And then he feels his neck, and it feels tender. And it turns out he had marks on his neck. It was all bruised up from this thing choking him out. And it brought him back to, like, that really happened. He's now, like, actually in fear for his life. Chris immediately calls Sammy and tells Sammy everything that happened. And Sammy can't believe any of it. She felt helpless because she's on the other side of the country. She can't help him. And Chris is just petrified. And he's like, he can barely speak, he's like unable to articulate what's happening. He's describing these cuts on his hand and his neck, but there's no one in his apartment. And Sammy's trying to get him to call the police, but Chris is like, I can't call the police. What am I gonna tell him? That a shadowy figure is coming in my apartment and choking me? They're gonna think I'm crazy. Chris decides he's gonna approach this head on. Maybe that woman in San Francisco did put some curse on me. I need to at least research it. And so there was a religious bookstore right near his house that he figured might have some things on demonic possession and demons, the occult. And he goes in there and he kind of awkwardly approaches the store owner and is like, I'm looking for, books about demons and witchcraft and like how to protect yourself against that. And the guy points him towards a section of the store. And so Chris goes over there, he scoops up a whole bunch of books. He also buys like a whole bundle of crucifixes. So like at least 10. So he's got all these crucifixes, he's got all these books about demonic possession and witchcraft. He buys all of that and he leaves and he goes back to his apartment. When he gets back after doing some research, he ends up putting these crucifixes all over his apartment, like every room. And he takes salt and he draws a line all through his apartment against the baseboard of every wall in the house. And at every corner of the house, he'd pile up little piles of salt. He was going to do all the things that people say to do if you're dealing with demons or ghosts or anything through witchcraft. He was kind of grasping at straws a little bit. So he went out and did everything he thought he could possibly do to protect himself. That night, which was April 16th, we don't know what happened to Chris, but something scared him so badly that in the middle of the night, in a full panic, he runs out of his apartment and he checks into a hotel and does not stay at his apartment. The next morning, April 17th, when Sammy called Chris to check on him, now remember, this is 1999, there was just landline phones. So she calls his landline at his apartment to check on him. There's no answer because he's not there, he's at the hotel. And Sammy, who's been speaking to Chris, and other friends that have been speaking to Chris, and everyone's concerned about his mental health and what's going on with him, when she doesn't get Chris to pick up his phone, she calls the police and she says, hey, I'm concerned about my friend. Can you do a welfare check on this guy? And they go over to his apartment and it's locked, and they kind of look in the windows and everything just seems kind of quiet. And so they leave and they tell Sammy, like, hey, look, it's locked. We can't really do anything. Let us know if you don't hear from him in the next couple of days. And so that was it. And so Sammy's like super concerned. And so she goes to work on the 17th. And then when she gets back, she has a voicemail from Chris, who had called her at some point during the day while she was out. And on the voicemail, Chris tells her in a voice that was different than the past few days. The past few days, he was scared. He was really scared. This time, he is defeated. He was like resigned to whatever was going on. And he says to Sammy on the voicemail, he's under attack. And that tonight, they're gonna kill me. And there's nothing I can do. As soon as she's done listening to the message, Sammy calls Chris, but she can't get in touch with him. She knows she just talked to the police who were there at his apartment that day. They're probably just gonna tell her like, hey, wait until tomorrow. We just told you, earlier, just give it a couple days. And so she just decides that she's gonna go to bed and she's gonna try calling him again on April 18th. On the morning of April 18th, Chris didn't show up for work. And word got back to Sammy, who was already going to reach out to Chris that morning anyways, but the friends and family are talking about what's going on with Chris. And so word got back to her that Chris had missed work. And so she calls Chris, he's not picking up from his landline. And now she calls the police back and she says, hey, you were there yesterday. I know it was locked, but he hasn't shown up for work today. Everybody's concerned about him. Can you please go over and check? And so the police go back over to Chris's apartment. And this time, the front door is unlocked. And they go inside and they're met with this very strange scene. You have all these crucifixes that are on the wall. You have the salt that lines every room in the house. There are all these candles that have burned down to the wick. There are little scraps of paper all over the apartment that were handwritten, little messages that Chris was leaving all over the house, warding off spirits and demons. I mean, it just looked like out of a Hollywood set for some demonic movie or something. And they search the house and there's no sign of Chris. They're yelling for him. There's no sign of him. And they make their way into the bathroom where they discover Chris's body. Chris was in his bathtub, no water in the bathtub. He's fully clothed. There's all these candles all around the outside of this bathtub. There's, more crucifixes and weird relics that are in the bathroom with him. And he's on his knees and he's slouched up against the wall with his hands kind of tucked against his chest. He had no external injuries. He was just dead. And so the police take Chris's body and the coroner comes in and does a report, and it comes out that Chris died of natural causes. He died of a heart attack. And so when friends and family saw that that was his cause of death, they didn't buy it. They're like, I don't know how to describe what happened to him. But over the past 7 days, Chris went from this happy, healthy, successful guy to a complete raving paranoid lunatic. And no one knows why. It's certainly possible that it was just a very poorly timed heart attack, mixed in with someone having a psychotic break. Or some people say that he really was cursed by that woman in San Francisco, and that was the result. She said, you're going to die within the week, and he literally died within the week. And he described regularly over the phone to his friends and family as this was happening, these horrible experiences at night with these shadow beings in his room and it attacking him. It's just this crazy story that to this day leaves friends, family, and investigators baffled. So I'd love to hear in the comments what you think happened to Christopher Case. Was this a natural death, or was this something else? Let me know in the comments. I'll do my best to go through and respond to as many as I possibly can. So if you enjoyed this video and you want to see more videos like this one, I would encourage you to gently slap the like button and then subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly 3 to 4 uploads that look an awful lot like the video you just saw. If you want to get in touch with me, you can message me on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. Also, I'm very active on TikTok, where my handle is MrBallen, so the same as my YouTube channel. I also go live on TikTok Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday at 10 p.m. Eastern. So I'd love to see you over there, or on Instagram, or on YouTube, or all these different places. But no matter where I see you, I really appreciate your support. And that's going to do it, guys. Until next time, take care. It is an unfortunate reality of being human and living on planet Earth that sometimes people go missing without any clue as to what happened to them. One day they're here, the next day they're gone. There's no clear indication of what happened. And despite everybody else's best efforts, nothing is ever learned about what happened to them. And so their families and their friends, they're left with this void in their lives that I can only imagine how terrible that is. There's no closure. There's like that perpetual sense that if you could just find more information out, you could find out what happened to your loved one, to your friend, to your colleague. But many times, people never get that. These people just go missing and that's it. But in some cases where people suddenly go missing, they'll turn up again. Sometimes days, weeks, months, years later, in totally different locations from where they went missing. But sometimes, in very rare circumstances, these people that go missing will reemerge days, weeks, months, years later, not having any idea how they got there or what happened to them. And so today I'm going to share 3 of these reappearance stories. The first 2 are the most well-known. They're very famous. And the third one is not as well-known, but equally as intriguing. But before we get into today's 3 stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place, because that is all I do, and I upload 3 to 4 times a week, if not more. So if that's something you'd be interested in, I would encourage you to please gently perform a lobotomy on the like button, and then subscribe to my channel, turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my 3 to 4 weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into the stories. In 1978, a 23-year-old named Stephen Kubacki was attending a college called Hope University in Michigan. It was a small Christian school where he was studying German and history. Stephen was a little more free-spirited than the typical student enrolled at Hope University, which was very conservative. He was a big-time outdoor enthusiast, and he loved to go skiing. In February of 1978, which was just months before Stephen was set to graduate, he decided he wanted to go on a solo ski trip around the Lake Michigan area. And so this area was known as the Lake Michigan Triangle. It's also known as just the Michigan Triangle, and it's an awful lot like the Bermuda Triangle, which is in that northern section of the Atlantic Ocean where planes and boats have gone missing over the years kind of inexplicably. Well, the Michigan Triangle is like that. And starting in the late 1800s, there were all these disappearances that started occurring in the Michigan Triangle area. And so Stephen was going to be skiing around the Lake Michigan area, and so he would be in the Michigan Triangle. Now, he had told his friends and his family that he was just going out for a day trip, and Stephen was a very accomplished outdoorsman, excellent cross-country skier, so really no one bats an eye when he decides to go out and, go skiing. No one even thought twice about it. They're like, all right, cool, we'll see you tomorrow. A day after Stephen had left for this ski trip, some snowmobilers were out in the Michigan Triangle area, and they spotted a trail of ski tracks that led up to the edge of the lake, where at the edge of the lake were a set of skis and 2 ski poles. Just stopped abruptly, and they see that this looks like someone might have fallen into the lake. Now, there weren't any clear breaks in the lake itself, but they figured it was worth telling police and to at least let them know in case they're looking for someone who might have gone missing in the area. And so it was around this time that Stephen Kubacki's friends and family started to recognize that he wasn't back yet, and he should have been. And so they end up calling in an official missing persons report because he should have been back. And so the two things happened in tandem. You have the snowmobilers that have found the ski poles and the skis, and you have the missing persons report that's come out for Stephen Kubacki, and immediately they're connected, and this massive search effort is launched with a focus on where those skis and the poles were found. Now, they looked everywhere, but it was like his tracks went right up to the edge of the lake and then just stopped. There weren't any more tracks on the lake. There were no breaks in the lake. There was nothing there. It was like he just suddenly either went into the ground or just vanished somehow. And so as hundreds of people have descended on this area to look for Steve Kubacki, his backpack shows up right next to his skis and ski poles. That was the first place that everybody went, and his backpack wasn't there. And they didn't really even know how to investigate it. It was just this weird phenomenon where all these people are like, I guess it just must have been there the whole time. They just didn't have a good answer for it. And so after a long and very elaborate search, ultimately they had to call it off. And so they told the family and friends that what must have happened is he got out of his skis and put everything down, went onto the lake, and it cracked and he fell in. And so that's what everybody believed. I mean, why wouldn't they? 15 months go by and Stephen's father hears a knocking on the door. And who's at the door? Stephen Kubacki. And when he sees his son, he can't believe it because he believed his son was dead. But Kubacki has no idea, Steve has no idea how much time has passed. He saw a newspaper, Stephen saw a newspaper in his father's house, and it showed that it had been 15 months since he disappeared. He asked his father, like, how can this be? And he told Stephen, you were near Lake Michigan. That's 700 miles away. How did you get here? And Stephen's like, I woke up in a field about 40 miles from here, and I went to, my aunt's house, your sister's house, and she brought me here. And no one had any idea how he got there or why he was in the field in Pittsfield to begin with. In addition, Stephen had on clothes that he didn't recognize. He had a new backpack that had maps and all sorts of kind of like trinkets from different parts of the country. He had been to apparently San Francisco, Sacramento, all over California, to Chicago, to Utah. He's been all over the country, according to the things that are in his backpack. He had $40 in cash, he had new sneakers, new glasses, and he had a t-shirt on from a Wisconsin marathon. It says he was a participant in. And one of the only things that Stephen would say to the media, because he basically swore off the media and he didn't want to give his story to anybody, he just said to one of the news outlets that he felt like he had been doing a lot of running. But other than that, we don't know what he was doing for 15 months, and apparently he doesn't either. In early 2018, Danny Philippidis was a 49-year-old firefighter living in Canada. He had a wife, he had 2 kids, he was happy, healthy, successful, and every year, he and his colleagues at the firehouse would go on a ski trip to New York, where they would go skiing at a mountain called Whiteface. And so on February 7th, 2018, Danny and his 7 colleagues are at Whiteface. They're enjoying themselves. Danny was an avid skier. Like, this is something he really looked forward to, was this annual retreat to Whiteface Mountain. And it was getting to be lunchtime, and his 7 colleagues said, hey, let's go down to the lodge and get a bite to eat. Danny was just having a great time on the mountain, and he was like, I'm gonna just do a couple more runs. I'll meet you guys in about 30 minutes or so. I'm gonna do a couple more runs before lunch. So they go down to the lodge and Danny continues to do a couple more runs. And so after an hour or so, and Danny still hasn't shown up at the lodge, his 7 colleagues have finished eating and they're like, you know what? I bet Danny just decided he wanted to skip lunch and he's probably just fine. And so they end up just going out and skiing the rest of the day. But by the end of the night, when the mountain is starting to shut down, they're all checking their phones for messages from Danny. They haven't gotten anything from him. They haven't seen him. They decide, let's go check out, his room back at the hotel and make sure that he's there. Maybe he got sick and he left, something like that. And the resort was attached to the mountain itself. So they just walked right over to his room. They knocked, he didn't answer, but then they went out back and they found his car, and his car was still there. They went to the front desk, they explained the situation. They ended up going in the room and checking to see if he was in there. He wasn't, but all of his personal belongings are still inside of the room. So Danny, who has not shown up after going skiing for this additional run, clearly hasn't left the mountain because his car's still here, his cash, his passport, everything is in his room, but no one knows where Danny is. And so they launched this massive search for Danny. And I mean, this day it was so crowded at Whiteface. There's so many people there. And also, it had snowed a ton before they even started skiing that day. So it would have been very difficult to move very far off the mountain, let's say, if someone wanted to. I mean, just there was too much snow on the ground. So he couldn't have gotten very far. And there were lots of people there that they could interview to say, have you seen this man? They had a picture of him, you know, and no one had seen him. And there was no sign of him. Despite this massive search effort, no one has any idea what happened to him. The authorities call off the search and they tell his loved ones and his friends that, you know, Danny must have succumbed to the elements. That's the only explanation we can give. We can't find him now because the snow's pretty deep, but hopefully when the weather warms up, we'll be able to launch another search and we can recover his body. And so that's the news that's passed to his wife, to his kids, to his friends, and it's just devastating. And then a couple days later, Danny's wife is home, trying to adjust to this awful new normal, and she gets a phone call from a number she doesn't recognize. And she picks it up, and it's a little bit hard to hear, but she immediately recognizes her husband's voice. And she can tell right away that there's something wrong. Like he's not making sense. She's like, Danny, is that you? Is that you? And Danny's like, I don't know where I am. I don't know how I got here. Where are you? What am I doing? And so she immediately tells him, you have to call the police. You have to call the police. They have to come get you. And finally he agrees and he hangs up. The police receive a phone call from Danny, and he doesn't know where he is. He's saying that, you know, my wife told me to call you. I'm very confused. I don't know what's going on. And they ask him to describe where he is. And he starts describing what's around him. And police are able to, you know, eventually pinpoint where he is. And it turns out he was near Sacramento, California, 2,900 miles away from Whiteface Mountain. Even more strangely, when the police go to collect Danny, he's still wearing his ski gear, you know, winter jacket, winter pants, ski boots on. He even still had his goggles on his head. And he has a haircut. He has a fresh haircut, and he has a brand new phone, a brand new iPhone. But he had no money. He had no wallet. He had nothing. He had left all of his belongings in his room. So looking at him like, how did you get a new phone? How did you get a haircut? Why did you get a new haircut? And when you got your haircut, why didn't the person cutting your hair let someone know that a man who's visibly confused wearing ski gear is getting a haircut in here? And so it's just this totally strange mystery that Danny, to this day, and anybody that knows Danny and his friends, the investigators, everybody, no one knows how he got there. How does a guy without a car, without any money, wearing ski gear, go from New York to Sacramento, California, somehow get a haircut and buy a new phone, and then just suddenly come to and be like, oh, that's right, I'm Danny, and I'm gonna call my wife and let her know where I am now. Like, it was just crazy. So this last story was documented in the official American Ethnology Report from 1897, 1898. Although the story is, you know, well documented in this report, the location is unclear. People have speculated that it's either Ireland, Scotland, or Wales. So just take this with a grain of salt that the location is not known. It's an older story, but it was officially documented in an official report. In 1898, a 12-year-old boy was playing at this river that ran near his house. He was out in the forest, he was playing to this river, and he had a bow and arrow, and he was practicing shooting his bow and arrow. And after a little while, he got bored of his bow and arrow, and he went to the stream itself, and he started to build a little dam in the river to try to catch some fish. And as he's building this thing up, he's down on his knees building up this little dam in the river, he notices someone is walking down the river towards him. And he looks up, and he would describe this person as looking normal, a normal looking stranger. It's a gentleman who shows up. He's wearing a nice suit. He walks over to Wofford, and he apparently just came out of the woods. And he says, hey, what are you doing? And the boy, you know, he's like, oh, I'm making this fish trap. And he's like, man, that looks like a lot of work. Like, you know, you should take a break. And the boy's like, yeah, I guess I could take a break. And the gentleman just says, well, if you want, you know, while you're taking this break, you can come to my house. It's just up past the bend here. My family's there. You can have a meal with us, and then you can come back and you can finish your fish trap. And so, you know, this is a different time. This is the late 1800s, and I'm not suggesting that at the time it was totally cool to go with strangers into weird houses in the forest, but the boy felt compelled to say yes. He didn't want to be rude, and maybe his fear of strangers is less extreme than it is, for us today in 2020. And so he agrees to go with the man. They make their way up past the river into the forest a little bit, and they come up to this cabin. Now, the boy played in the woods here, and he had never seen this house before. But he's not too concerned, because as soon as he gets to the house, this cabin in the woods, he sees that the lights are on, and he hears kids playing inside, and a close family friend of his family's is sitting on the porch talking to one of the other apparently family members of the stranger. And so the boy's put at ease, and he says hi to the family friend, and the family friend, waves back. The boy goes inside, and he sees that this family has a couple of kids roughly his age. They're playing, goofing around. They have dinner, and this wonderful meal, and the boy Wofford is like, man, this is so great. And after the meal, he lays down and falls asleep. He kind of loses track of time. The boy falls asleep at this cabin. And so he wakes up early the next morning, and he feels horrible because he didn't mean to fall asleep, and he didn't tell anyone from his family where he was going. And he's thinking, man, they're going to be so worried about me. And so as he's getting up to leave, the stranger is already awake, the one that had met him down by the river and called him up to the house. And the boy says, hey, can you walk me down back to the river? And the stranger's like, I can take you part of the way down, sure. So the two of them, they're having small talk, and the boy's thanking the man for his generosity. And so as they're walking, they're passing by an orchard on one side and a cornfield on the other. And it's this beautiful morning, the sun's just coming up, and the boy remembers thinking how beautiful the setting was. But he also was thinking, like, I don't even know where I am right now. And I'm assuming he's walking me back to where I live, but this doesn't look familiar at all. And the stranger stops. They get to almost a junction right at the end of the orchard and of the cornfield. And the stranger tells the boy, Wofford, he says, hey, just go straight. You're going to turn down this way, turn back, and you'll be at the river again where we met. And the boy thanks the stranger, and the stranger turns and starts walking back towards his cabin and says, hey, good luck, see ya. And the boy starts following the man's directions. And Wofford, as he's walking, following the stranger's directions, he's suddenly curious and turns around to look back at this strange person who had brought him up to the house and then now brought him back. And he's stunned because suddenly the orchard and the cornfield are not there. There is no orchard or cornfield. It's just deep, dark forest. And he's like, what's going on? He turns back, and there's a search party, or it looks like a search party, running up to him. Part of the search party is the family friend that he had seen at the house. And the boy's like looking at these people running towards him, like they're running to him. And he recognizes the family friend, and he can tell they're like urgently looking for him. And he felt bad because he knows he slept over through the night. So he's like, hey, I'm here. And they're like, where have you been? And the boy turns to the family friend, and he's like, didn't you tell them I was with you? And the family friend is like, what are you talking about? And he's like, yeah, the house with the family. We ate dinner together last night. And the guy, the family friend, is like, I've been looking for you for the past several days. I've been with your family looking for you. You've been gone for 3 days. And the boy is like, what? And as he's describing the kind of general vicinity of where this cabin was, he's kind of pointing back up towards where it was and describing it from where the river was. The family says to him that since you've been missing, we've heard rhythmic drumming non-stop coming from the section of the forest that you just described. We could never pinpoint where it was coming from. And now that you just showed up, the drumming has stopped. And so the kid's terrified, but there's no answers. Pretty creepy. So 3 very strange stories that luckily all of them ended with the person being found again, but it doesn't change the fact that the mystery remains. Where did they go? It's like they left the earth for a couple of days, or in Stephen Kubaki's case, for over a year, and then came back. It was like a glitch in the matrix or something. And so I would love to hear in the comments what you think can possibly explain how these people are disappearing without a trace and then reappearing days, weeks, months, years later, not having any idea how they got there or what had happened to them. How can we possibly reconcile that? And if you like this video and you want to see more videos like this, I would ask you to please gently perform a lobotomy on the like button, and then subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of my other 3 to 4 weekly uploads that I do every week that sound an awful lot like the story you just heard. If you want to get in touch with me, you can message me on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. I'm also very active on TikTok, where my handle is MrBallen. So you can follow me over there. I also go live on TikTok Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday at 10 p.m. Eastern. So you can check me out over there or on Instagram or here on YouTube or any of these places. But wherever you're finding me, I really appreciate your support, and I really have enjoyed making these videos, and I hope you've enjoyed them too. That's going to do it, guys. Until next time, talk to you soon. Last year, I stayed for about 2 weeks in a cabin in a very rural part of Pennsylvania. We were up in the mountains. We were very isolated from everybody else. There were these huge windows on the back side of the house that just looked directly into a forest. At night, when you're looking out that window and it's just totally dark, you feel so uneasy that something could be looking in and you can't see it. And so it's just this awful sense of being watched if I was even near that back room at night. And I think that all comes from this deep-seated fear I have of being isolated in the woods somewhere, being stalked or being watched by something that you can't see. And so anytime I see a story about some cabin in the woods where some potentially paranormal thing has happened around them, it really piques my interest because I can relate to that fear on a primal level. And so today we have, you guessed it, a cabin in the woods stalking story. It was featured on Paranormal Witness, which is a show on Sci-Fi Network. It's one of the more popular episodes called The Cabin, and it's one of my all-time favorites, and I hope I do it justice in today's story. Keith and Diane grew up in the same town, London, Ohio, which was a very rural, small town in the middle of Ohio. They were high school sweethearts, and after high school, they would end up getting married. Fast forward 6 years, and Keith and Diane have been married for 6 years. They have a daughter named Raven, who's 4 years old, and Diane has just found this beautiful new home in London, Ohio, so same place they grew up, that was a little more isolated than any other properties they were looking at. It was still within London, Ohio, but it was in the forest. It was way off the beaten path, so to speak. But, Keith was a hunter and he loved the forest, and, Diane loved the forest too, so they liked the idea of having that privacy and kind of living away from other people. So very quickly they decide to buy the house, and they move in and they kind of settle into their new routine. At this time, Keith was not only working full-time during the day as a welder, but at night he was taking night classes to prepare for this apprenticeship program he was trying to get into. Keith is gone 5 days a week for 12 hours at a stretch, leaving Diane home alone with Raven when she wasn't at school. And Diane was a stay-at-home mom, so she was at this house a lot. So in those first couple of weeks that they had moved into this house, and Diane's getting used to being alone quite a bit, Diane at night would hear what sounded like something she described as scampering. Some animal is moving around outside of the house. And from time to time, she'd poke her head out. She had this big window that sat over the kitchen sink. So whenever she was doing dishes, she'd be looking directly into their forest in her backyard, and she'd poke her head out and she'd try to get a glimpse of whatever it was. She just assumed it was, a deer or a dog or something like that. It wasn't a cause for concern. It was just something she noticed within those first couple of weeks. One night, after she had put Raven to bed and Keith was still out at night school, Diane was cleaning up the downstairs and she was doing the dishes and she was looking out the window and she starts hearing that scampering sound. And as she's looking, she's got light behind her from inside the house, causing kind of a glare on the glass. So she's up close to the pane of glass, kind of peering out to try to catch a glimpse of this deer or dog or whatever it was. And as she's looking out into the tree line, which is very close to her house, there's only a separation of maybe 20 or 25 feet from the edge of her house to the edge of the forest. And as she's looking, she swears she sees a set of eyes looking back at her. And to her, it immediately confirms that that's a dog. There's a dog that's gotten loose, and that's what's been roaming around my property. She's not frightened. She's used to being out near the woods. So she's just like, okay, cool, it's a dog. And so she finishes the dishes and she goes into the living room, which is on the other side of the house. And as she's picking up toys and moving things around, she happens to look up towards the window in their living room that's looking basically in the other direction as that window above her sink. She's looking in the opposite direction. And to her horror, there is a set of eyes that are at human level that are right up against the glass. She only sees it for a second. She sees the reflection of the eyes before she backs away startled. But there's light on in the room she's in, so she doesn't have a great view of what's outside. And she's not even sure if she actually saw those eyes. She's not sure if she's scaring herself. So she goes back into the kitchen to look out that window and see if she can see those eyes that she had seen before that she believed belonged to a dog. She was hoping that they would be gone and that would kind of account for the eyes she just saw at the living room window, even though it would have been a very tall dog. She goes into the kitchen, she starts leaning towards the window, and then right as she's about to put her head almost against the glass, a head comes right in front of her on the opposite side of the glass with these glowing gold eyes looking right at her. She's horrified. She practically falls over and she's looking up from the ground, and there's this face looking in the window directly at her. And she's scampering back like on the ground, getting out of the kitchen. And right at that moment, she hears car tires out on the driveway. And it's Keith. Oh my God, Keith's gonna run into somebody that's outside. She hears the door open and she's just praying it's Keith, and sure enough, he calls out and he sees her on the ground in the living room and he's like, what's going on? And so she immediately tells him she definitely saw somebody outside. She thought it was a dog, maybe it wasn't. And Keith, he's a hunter, you know, he knows they're out in the woods. They've just moved into this house. He's thinking maybe my wife is actually a little bit scared to be so isolated out here. Keith goes outside with a flashlight. He's looking all around. He's walking the property. He can't find tracks. He can't see anything. And so he comes back inside, and he never really believed that it was anything other than maybe her imagination or just some random animal outside. And so he's just telling her like, hey, I know we just moved in. I'm sure you're stressed. You're here alone all the time. You know, you got this huge woods right next to our house. You're going to hear animals. I just wouldn't sweat it. It's probably nothing to worry about. She was not cool with being, you know, told don't worry about it because she knows what she saw. So a month goes by and Keith and Diane have stopped talking about whatever Diane saw. You know, there wasn't anything else happening at the house. She wasn't seeing eyes or animals, hearing any scampering sounds. It was just kind of back to normal. Keith is gone. He's going to night school, and Diane's home by herself, and she's in the kitchen. She's looking out that window. She doesn't hear any scampering or anything, and without any warning, she sees a set of eyes suddenly appear on the edge of the window just outside of the woods. She sees the eyes dead on, and she backs up from the window. She's thinking to herself, I have to protect Raven. And her first thought is turn off all the lights in the house. That way it can't see me. And so she runs around the house, terrified, but knew she had to do it, turning off every light. The last light she turns off is the living room light, and she's up against the wall, and as she hits the light in the living room, making everything dark, she suddenly gets a clear picture out that living room window where she had seen the eyes as well the month earlier. And standing pressed against the glass is an absolute human figure with eyes at human level, these orange glowing eyes at eye level, standing right against her window, looking in the window directly at her. Horrified, she starts making her way into the kitchen by sliding up against the wall. They have a landline phone that was hung in the kitchen. And so she gets to the phone, trying to keep an eye on that back window. She can see the side of this thing's silhouette. She calls 911 and says, there's someone outside my house. They won't go away. As soon as she hangs up, from her perspective, she can only see its shoulder. She watched the shoulder disappear out of her view. She poked her head back in the living room, and sure enough, it's gone. And as she's sitting there, it's silent. There's no sound in the house. She can hear clear scampering sounds, like running sounds outside of her house, as this thing is running all the way around her house. And she's sitting there wondering if this thing's gonna break a window to come inside. What would she even do? And so finally, she sees the flashing lights of a cop car pulling into the driveway, and she hears the police knock at the door. She runs to the door, opens it up, and she's hysterical. And the police are trying to calm her down to just get the story of what's going on. And she's pointing out, you know, saying there's something out there. And the police start looking around the property. Keith comes home, and he knows instinctively what's probably happened because the police are scanning the property for something, and he's thinking she saw this thing again. You know, whatever it is, it probably was just a reflection of herself in the glass. And now she's called the police. You know, this is a small town. Keith is worried that people are going to think he's crazy. And so he comes in, and he regretted this, but he immediately got mad at his wife. Like, what are you doing? You know, like, you're calling the cops. Like, there's nothing here. I looked last time, they're looking now. And they were even saying, like, we haven't seen anything. We're going to look for a little bit longer, but there's no sign of anybody being here. And at some point, the police are like, yep, we didn't find anything. And the police are like, you know, let us know if anything else happens. And they leave. Keith and Diane are left just fighting. So 4 months go by without incident. There's no scampering outside. There's no eyes in the windows. And Keith and Diane have kind of moved past that whole ordeal, and they're, you know, back to normal. They're really not even thinking about it. And even Diane would say, like, I did begin to believe that it was just in my imagination and that I was just stressed and maybe overwhelmed at how often I was alone in that house and it was just getting to me. And 4 months go by. It's early December of 1981, and it was the first big snowfall of the winter. And Keith wakes up one morning after the snowfall, a few inches on the ground, and he decides, because his family's still sleeping, that he's going to go out and he's going to get donuts and bring them back for the family, donuts and coffee. So it's still dark outside. He goes outside, starts up his car, he's rubbing his eyes, he's still tired, and he's adjusting his rear view mirror. And when he stops it for a second and he's looking up there, he thinks he sees somebody standing behind his car. What? And they go over to the other side of the house. Who's doing this? What's doing this? And so he starts going to the other side of the house and he can't see any more prints. And he's looking up at the top of his house and he's thinking, am I going crazy? Something's on my house? Like, what's going on? And so he goes inside and he calls his hunting buddy, Dennis, who's the only person that lives relatively close to them. And he's like, you gotta come over here right now. I got something weird going on. I think someone's stalking my house. I can't be sure. You gotta come over here. Dennis is like, I'll be there in a minute. When Dennis gets there, Keith's outside with his rifle. And Dennis is like, what are you doing? And he's like, somebody, and he shows him the prints, jumped on my roof. Someone's on my roof. I don't know what's going on, but someone I think is on my roof. And as they're talking about it, they hear what sounds like thump. Something just landed really hard from a pretty high distance. And it was on the other side of the house. They kind of run around, rifle, and Dennis had his rifle too. They go to the other side and they see like 2 clear footprints, but 20 feet away from the edge of the house. Meaning this thing on the roof, if it jumped off, it jumped not only 2 stories to the ground, but it jumped 20 feet out away from the house as well, because there was no other footprints. And they just heard it land, and it ran off into the forest. And so Dennis and Keith look at each other, and Dennis is like, what do you want to do? And Keith's like, let's go after it. Now, Dennis and Keith, they hunt in these woods all the time. And they see right away that the footprints, the tracks of this person or creature or whatever it is, they're about 14 inches long, and it appears to be a bipedal creature. It does not appear to be on 4 legs. Something's moving on 2 legs. And they're thinking about just how would this person be able to get on the roof? What animal runs around that has a 14-inch track that runs on 2 legs? Like, they're not really sure what to make of it. Is it a person? Is it a creature? We don't know. And so they follow the tracks into the woods, and the whole time they had this awful sensation that something's watching them. And from time to time, they would hear something a ways away from them that sounded like a big animal moving in the forest, but they could never quite get to it in time. And at some point, they started hearing noises behind them. And they're thinking, like, is it possible that this thing has run ahead of us and then looped back around and is now tracking us? Like, they were feeling really uncomfortable. And as they're about to just kind of abandon this search, because they've been looking for this thing for hours, they keep following its tracks, they get to a clearing, and they find this tiny cabin that neither of them had seen before, right in the middle of the clearing. And they see that these tracks lead right up to it, and they follow the tracks up to the cabin, and the tracks stop right outside the door. There's one door leading into this cabin, and the door is shut. And they're thinking, like, what animal can open and shut doors? And so Dennis starts immediately hitting on the door, trying to get this person to come outside and show themselves. We know you were over at Keith's property. Get out here. We followed you here. We know it's you. There's no sound inside. There's no movement inside. They're looking in the windows. There's nothing. Keith realizes, like, it's a bad look for us to have tracked this person to their house. We have guns. Like, this is a bad look for us. We can't be here. We need to leave and just let this go. They have a couple more choice words, and then they leave. And they decide, instead of going back through the woods, they go to the nearest road that they could hear nearby. They go to the road, and they go to a payphone. They call Keith's father, who comes to pick them up. And when they hop in the car, Keith's dad is like, why do you have guns? And Keith and Dennis explain what happened, and they describe this cabin in the woods that they were just at. And Keith's dad is like, oh, I know who lives in that cabin. It's this guy who works at the tire shop. He's a loner type guy, older guy. No one really knows much about him. So Dennis is like, we got to go to that tire shop. I want to get a look at this guy. Keith's a little bit unsure, like he doesn't want to blow this out of proportion, but they ultimately decide that they're going to bring a beat up tire to this tire shop and ask to get it repaired to try to get a look at this person who apparently owns the cabin. So they go to this tire shop. They know that the front desk attendant is not the guy who owns the cabin. It's the actual mechanic who's in back. And so they give the tire over, and the front desk guy yells back to George. Says, "Hey, George, come out here, you got a tire." And so Keith would describe George coming out of the shadows to get the tire. And he's like the 6'5" older guy who looks up at Keith and Dennis. And he's got these orange eyes. Keith would say it was the most distinctive set of eyes he'd ever seen. And he looks up at them, and George has a moment of recognition that he's looking at the two men that just tracked him to his house. And Dennis and Keith are looking at him thinking, "We know it was you." And they both recognize it. George looks down, walks away with the tire. And then when he finishes whatever he's doing with the tire, he rolls it out to the middle of the floor to stay in the shadows. Keith and Dennis are like, he didn't want to show himself again. He knows that we know he's the guy. Dennis and Keith leave and think, man, like, that's so weird. He's an old guy. I mean, he kind of fits the description, I guess. You know, he's a big guy, 14-inch tracks. That could be him. But none of it really added up. I mean, he's an older guy. How's he getting on the roof? Keith is like, I can't tell police what happened because I would have to admit that I stalked him to his house with a gun. That's how I know he's there, and he didn't commit a crime. At least I can't pin him to a crime. And so he can't tell the police. He doesn't want to tell his wife because his wife not only would have a big told you so moment, he knew that she would immediately want to leave, like move. And he did not have the financial resources to move. And so he decides to just kind of keep it to himself and hope that he does not run into George again. So for a few months, there's no sightings of anything strange happening at their house, at Keith and Diane's house. But in March of 1982, 3 months after their encounter with George at the tire shop, Dennis shows up at Keith's house. And he says, "Hey, get in, I want to show you something." And so Keith gets in Dennis's car, and they start driving, and Keith can tell that Dennis is taking him towards this cabin in the woods where George lives. And Keith says to Dennis, "We can't do this. We cannot go to this guy's house. We know he did it, but what are we going to do?" And Dennis goes, "No, I just found out that George died. He's dead. So we can just go check it out right now. We can go check out his residence." And Keith is like, "I feel bad about it, but okay, let's go check it out." And so they start driving down this one access road that would lead to George's cabin, and they find a cop car is sitting in the middle of the road. It would turn out that Dennis knew the cop, and he explained the whole strangeness behind this cabin and how it related to them. And the cop at first was very reluctant to give any information about why he was there or what was going on at the cabin, but ultimately he relented and said, "Actually, you know, I'm here because there's some strangeness with the cabin. We don't really know what to make of it, and you know, if you want to, I can give you a quick peek of what the cabin looks like." Keith and Dennis are like super intrigued, and they're like, "Okay." And so they go into this cabin, and there's nothing in it. There's basically a chair and a table, but that's it. There's no personal effects. There's no food. There's nothing. It's just this empty, tiny space. And Keith and Dennis are, you know, shocked. They're like, "Wow, this guy was living like a hermit, basically." And they thought that that was what the cop was referring to when he said there's some weirdness with this cabin. They're like, "Man, that's crazy. You know, George, how did he live like this for 40 years? Crazy." And the cop's like, "No, that's not the weird part." He goes, "That's the weird part." And he points at a sheet that's hanging down inside of the cabin. The cop goes over and pulls the sheet aside, and it revealed a metal door, a sliding door, and they slid it open, and immediately they're hit with this wet dog smell, like kind of a gross wet dog smell. And they go into this cell that had plate steel lining the walls with metal strips and rivets holding everything in place. It was like this metal encased tomb that they were in. And in the middle of the floor was a 10-foot chain link, and at the end there were shackles for wrists and for feet. And on the wall were all these scratch marks, old and new, all over the walls. And so the police officer's like, "Yeah, we're trying to figure out what old George was doing with this cell in his cabin in the middle of the woods." Keith and Dennis, they leave and they go back into their car and they're driving away, and neither of them are even talking about what they saw. But they know that something that was being held in that cage in the cabin had been the thing they had stalked. It had been the thing that had been stalking their property, Keith's property. it was the thing that was staring in the windows. It's all very unsettling. But Keith, Dennis, Diane never found out what it was. Keith would say, though, that there was no more stalking at his property once George had died. They never saw the eyes again. So no matter what this was, something was showing up at Keith and Diane's house and looking in the windows and, stalking them. And something made tracks, got on the roof of Keith and Diane's house, ran into the woods, and made its way back to George's cabin. Now, we don't know if that something was just George or if it was some creature